Inside report from the real estate events that were selling illegal properties in the West Bank. 10 flight attendants from Pakistan have gone missing after landing in Toronto. The neo-Nazi statue in Oakville honoring some Ukrainian World War II soldiers isn't being taken down. It's just in the shop for repairs. Haitians in Canada want to see a response that includes Haitians to the instability in Haiti. New Made in USA meat labels are being opposed by Canada, and anti-Muslim law in India is being enacted just before historic election. Good morning. It's Wednesday, March 13th. I'm Nora. Here are your headlines. Let's start in Montreal, where Una Barrett from Pivot managed to record footage from inside a real estate event that advertised lands in the West Bank. The event was part of a North American tour where Israeli real estate companies were promoting buying land in Israel and in the West Bank. Canada and much of the world considers land in the West Bank to be occupied and therefore illegal for Israel to settle. The event was held inside the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue Shiath Israel in Côte d'Ivoire. Barrett was able to get information on several locations in the West Bank that these agents were selling, like Neve Daniel, Maleh Adamim, and Efrat. Barrett said that she was gathering information for her mother, an Israeli who lives in France. One of the properties that was shown to Barrett in Efrat was a luxury condo expected to be finished in 32 months. Some of the locations will have their own heated pools. All of the new buildings have a safe room in case the buildings are attacked, something that Israel mandates by law. Buying a property in the West Bank is cheaper than in Israel, and foreigners can save 8% on purchases because they're exempt from paying sales taxes. When Barrett went to speak with lawyers who were part of the event, they insisted that Efrat and even Maleh Adamim were both perfectly legal places to invest in. And, quote, they will never take back these lands, unquote, said one of the lawyers. Outside the event, Barrett talked to protesters from both sides. I'll focus on the ones defending the event. In the video, there are two protesters featured. One who didn't seem to know that there was an event inside the synagogue selling land in the West Bank, and whose tone changed when he learned that it was happening. His tone quickly changed back, but it was interesting to see him hear about why people were actually protesting and say to himself, actually, maybe that's a legitimate reason. Another man that Barrett spoke to insisted that he's an Israeli extremist and that he can't be interviewed because it'll make him sound bad. It's an excellent piece of journalism, and even though the video is in French, you can read the English subtitles, and the event is recorded in English, so definitely check it out. Next to news from Now Toronto about 10 flight attendants who have disappeared after touching down in Toronto at Pearson Airport. The article is from Rowena Jassal, which cites news from the website Dawn, which is an English news service based in Pakistan, that says that on February 27th, Miriam Raza didn't return to work where she was scheduled after having landed in Toronto. A week before that, Gibran Balok also disappeared after a flight from Karachi to Toronto, and Faiza Mukhtar disappeared earlier in 2024. Toronto police said they couldn't locate any reports related to missing people, which I guess is supposed to mean that no one has filed a report, suggesting, of course, that these folks disappeared on their own accord. The carrier, PIA, has tried to limit how many younger workers are staffing international flights, as they see that young women in particular were disappearing after having landed in Canada or Europe. PIA says that the disappearances are related to their desire to, quote, escape challenging economic circumstances, unquote. Next to Oakville, where the National Post's Adrian Humphreys is reporting that a monument that was removed last week is not being removed for good. It's only in the cemetery shop. That's right. The monument to honor members of the 14th Waffen-SS, or the Galicia Division, was taken down last week in Oakville, Ontario, and as a result, many people celebrated. Many people have been calling for this memorial to be removed for a very long time. But it turns out that the monument is just in the shop. While it isn't something that I realize that monuments needed from time to time, a tune-up, I guess it seems that in this case, the monument may very well go back up. Next to Haiti, Ariel Henry resigned yesterday. At the same time, Canadian officials were in Jamaica with other countries to decide what should happen there. But Haitians in Quebec warned that if Haitians are not part of planning an international intervention or a stabilization plan, then things will continue to deteriorate. CBC Montreal's Joe Bongiorno is reporting that Le Concentration Haïtienne pour les Migrantes reacted to the news that Henry has stepped down by saying that Canada needs to stop interfering, along with other countries, and allow Haitians to actually manage their own affairs. The diaspora especially, they argue, need to be part of helping to build a stable Haiti. Many of their ideas have been ignored by the international players that decide how to intervene. For example, Kenya has been sent to deploy police officers there and try and quell the violence. The director of the Centre International de Documentation et d'Information Haïtienne, Caribbeenne et Afro-Canadienne, France Voltaire, said that Canada's support for Henry's presidency, quote-unquote, hasn't helped. Bongiorno quotes Chalmers Larose, professor of international relations, who said that the international plans to stabilize Haiti are going to fail because they don't appreciate the reality on the ground. Root issues need to be addressed, he said, and there's no way that elections can be held under the current circumstances. I do remind you all that back in 2004, Canada helped to plan the overthrow of President Jean-Bertrand Aristide. He was the first person to be elected after years of successive U.S.-backed dictators. This threw the country into chaos, a chaos that still echoes to this day. I was once talking to a guy I play soccer with, and he was saying that the thing that Haitians really need more than anything else is for Canada to just leave the country alone. Next, in 2026, be ready to have your meat, poultry, and eggs labeled Product of the USA if your eggs, poultry, and meat were raised, slaughtered, and processed in the United States. The Department of Agriculture made the decision that these labels can be used for animals, but only if their entire life cycle, including processing, happens in the United States. The labels are voluntary. Of course, Canada would find a reason to oppose this. The Canadian press is reporting that Ministers Lawrence Macaulay and Mary Ng have raised concerns. They are worried that animals who might have been born in Canada but slaughtered in the U.S. or hatched in the U.S. but turned into chicken sludge in Canada can no longer have labels on them saying produced in the USA, because they were by definition not fully produced in the USA. This change isn't just impacting Canada. The current rules allow the produced in USA label to be used for any imported meats or imported processed meats and then repackaged in the United States. Americans have launched petitions and stakeholder comments all support the change, says the article, which makes sense because consumers should know if their meat is imported and not be fooled by inaccurate labels. But Macaulay and Ng say that they are, or Canada is, though I, as a small part of Canada, am not, concerned about, quote, any measures that may cause disruptions to the highly integrated North American meat and livestock supply chains, unquote. And the Canadian Cattle Association exercised their use of hyperbole, saying that the rule is, quote, the most onerous standard in the world, unquote. Man, there's nothing more pathetic than a Canadian who wants to be an American. As someone who pays really close attention to make sure that my dairy is all from Canada, it's so gross to see Canada opposing a rule that will strengthen the domestic meat market of another country with a voluntary label. It's not even mandatory. Americans have the right to know if the meat that they're eating was actually produced in the United States. And Canada should not be claiming that Canadian meat, because it's so integrated in the United States, is actually American meat, because it isn't. It's Canadian. It's not American. My God, people. Anyway, the article ends with a little note that mentions that the voluntary labeling system is not the same as country of origin labels. Country of origin labels used to require that companies disclose which countries the beef and pork sold in products were born, raised, and slaughtered. But because global trade doesn't care at all about the rights of the consumer, especially the right of the consumer to know where their food comes from, that requirement was eliminated after a ruling by the World Trade Organization back in 2015. And finally, just before Narendra Modi seeks a third term as Prime Minister of India, which is rare for that country, his government has announced that it will implement the Citizenship Amendment Act. The act had not been implemented after nationwide protests stopped the government from doing so, reports Al Jazeera. It was passed in 2019, and it allowed Hindus, Parsis, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, and Christians who fled mainly from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan before December 31st, 2014, to be eligible for citizenship. Now, if you're keeping track, I didn't say Muslim. Muslim immigrants are not being granted the same citizenship rights. Modi's government are Hindu nationalists. There are some 200 million Muslims who live in India, which Al Jazeera points out makes Indian Muslims the world's third largest Muslim population. Many Muslims are worried that other citizenship rights for Muslims will be eroded in the aftermath of passing this legislation. The government has denied that it's specifically anti-Muslim, but there has been concerning rising Islamophobia in India since Modi was elected in 2014. Mob lynching, a rise in hate speech, attacks on Muslims, and vigilante violence have all been increasing. Those are your headlines for Wednesday, March 13th. I'm Nora. You're listening to this podcast at sandynora.com, on the Real News Network podcast feed, and anywhere you get your podcasts. And folks, you know what? I got the funniest message yesterday from someone who's listening to the Daily News and had to tell me something of how it was related to their private life. If you ever have a reaction like that to something I say on the news, tell me about it. I'd love to hear it because, God, if someone I went to high school with who was like the hottest guy in the school is now a cop doing discreditable things or credible things, I don't know, I'd be mentioning it on this podcast, so you might as well mention that to me. Thanks to that listener for that message. It made my day. And yeah, feel free to always send me that kind of stuff. I'll try to respond, and I'll probably read it at least. I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday. Make the most of it. I'll talk to you tomorrow.